Boundaries. It's a topic that comes up with almost every parent I talk with. How do you set boundaries? Which boundaries should you set? When and how do you hold a boundary? What do you do when your child crosses your boundary? All the boundary questions. Before we can start to answer any of those questions, I have noticed that there are three separate but overlapping things that tend to be lumped together into this one word, boundaries. And I think that it is helpful and important to separate them out and to name them because language is important. Our words matter. The language that we use affects our thoughts, our perceptions, our feelings, and our actions. So, in today's episode, I'm going to talk with you about those three things and give you some thoughts and examples of each. I hope you find it helpful. Welcome to Single Parenting with Connection, Not Perfection, the podcast that honors your messy reality. It's the support you crave without the usual emotional landmines. I'm your host, Dr. Gila, and I promise I will never tell you to just tag your partner in. Before we start, quick reminder. While I am a licensed psychologist and a certified coach, this podcast is not coaching and it's not therapy and it's not a replacement for medical or psychological advice. It is for educational and informational purposes only. All right, let's dive in. In my opinion, there are three separate, though overlapping, concepts that are wrapped up in the term boundaries. Briefly, those three are personal boundaries. That is what you are willing to do or willing to have done to you or not have done to you. Limits. This is telling someone to stop doing something or that they can't do something. And expectations, which is something that you are telling or asking someone else to do. I'm going to dive into each of these three and some key points to keep in mind for each of them. Now, these are overlapping. So, for example, your personal boundary may place a limit on somebody else, but I think it's important to tease them apart. The other thing I want you to hold in mind as we're talking about this is that our kids also get to set personal boundaries, sometimes limit our behavior, and sometimes have expectations that they place on us. So important to keep that in mind as well. All right, let's start with personal boundaries. I want to start with an example here. I have a client, I'm going to call her Stephanie, and Stephanie was feeling really burnt out, stressed out, tapped out. She actually runs a group therapy practice. And it turns out that her employees, who she supervises clinically and also is their boss, that they were coming to her at all times of the day and sometimes at night with all kinds of questions, both urgent and non-urgent. And she would answer them, whether it's by email or in person. So there really weren't any boundaries around when and how and what they could communicate with her. When she set boundaries around this, so for example, which kind of questions were appropriate to bring to her versus someone else on her team, and when she was going to be available to respond to non-emergency, non-urgent questions. Without these boundaries, it felt like she was constantly getting poked in the shoulder. And it meant that she constantly felt like she was at any given moment about to be asked a question, about to be interrupted, about to have a demand placed on her, because really these were expectations being placed on her. And it was wearing her down. When she set boundaries around it, she found that she was much better able to support her employees and her supervisees because when she was answering their questions, she was more present, she was more prepared, and she wasn't having this like increasing sense of resentment and annoyance. So she was able to support them better while also supporting herself better. And what's interesting is that this is actually a theme that has come up in our work about her parenting as well. So there are 5 points that I want to make here about personal boundaries. Number one, Personal boundaries are much more within your control than limits and expectations. Now, that doesn't mean that it's easy to set them, and it doesn't mean that you can control the other person's reaction to the boundary. So, in my client's case, for example, she couldn't control whether her supervisees continued to message her or knock on her door, but she could control how she responded to it. She also couldn't control how they felt about it, but she could control her peace. It does put limits on other people, so they may have feelings about it. If your personal boundary is that you don't want to be jumped on, then that's putting a limit on your child that they can't jump on you, and they may have feelings about that. But it is within your control, and I would say it is your responsibility to hold that personal boundary. We can't necessarily expect our child to respect that. They might not be capable of that in the moment. So, in that example, it's up to you, the person setting your personal boundary, to hold that personal boundary. So, maybe if your child wants to jump on you, maybe that means standing up so that they can't jump on your lap. Maybe it means putting a pillow on your lap or curling up in a ball, getting playful with it. So, this is the part that is in your control, and your responsibility is holding that boundary. Point number two that I want to make is that sometimes it is true that really the work is in expanding our capacity. And this is where other forms of self care come into play that don't rely on placing any burden on our kids. So, tending to your own personal needs in other ways and at other times to build your capacity in that moment so that you don't have to set as many personal boundaries. But I also think point three is that there are a lot of times when we parents don't set boundaries soon enough, where we are biting our tongue, grinning and bearing it, desperately trying to ignore that increasingly loud voice in your head saying, I am not comfortable with this. I don't like this. I am angry. I am annoyed. I am resentful. I am frustrated. We ignore that because we love our kids and we don't want to upset them and we don't want to hurt them. But what it does is it means that when you eventually set the boundary, because usually it's then going to build and build until ultimately you set the boundary, but now you are already at breaking point. And so now when you set it, you're setting it by snapping, by yelling, by maybe coming off as rejecting or critical. You're not setting it with the compassion, the connection, the patience, and maybe even playfulness. Playfulness can go a long way here. So this is point number four about boundaries. How you set them matters. So if you set them sooner, you are going to be much better able to set them in a way that is respectful and compassionate and patient and connection building instead of connection breaking. And then the fifth point about boundaries is that our kids get to have personal boundaries too. And there's two things important about this. One, when you are setting boundaries sooner and doing it in a way that is compassionate and patient and respectful, you are modeling for your kids that it is okay and healthy to set those personal boundaries, to have personal boundaries, to articulate personal boundaries, and to uphold personal boundaries. And you're modeling for them how to do that in a way that is supportive and compassionate to the other person, not hurtful and harmful. When you wait until the breaking point, then of course we are modeling setting personal boundaries in a place that comes from anger and resentment and frustration. And then the other piece is that when your child sets a personal boundary, to wherever possible, respect that boundary. So when they say no, to try to respect that no as much as you can. And that goes a long way in modeling for them how it feels to have your boundaries respected and validating that personal boundaries are okay, acceptable, healthy, valid, worthy. So, personal boundaries are not easy to set and hold, but they are certainly easier than limits and expectations because limits and expectations have to do with other people's behavior. And the reality is that you can't control someone else's behavior, or at least you can't control someone else's behavior without using physical force or fear. And since you're listening to this podcast, I am going to guess that using physical force and fear is not how you ideally want to parent. It's not your goal or your value. And the truth is that even with physical force and fear, you often still can't control other people's behavior. So let's talk about limits and expectations a little bit more. Limits, again, this is you can't or shouldn't, I don't want you to do X, Y, or Z. Now, there are natural limits baked into life. There's small daily limits like you can't have more blueberries because we don't have any more left. You can't play in the snow because it all melted. You can't watch the next episode of your favorite show because it hasn't aired yet. These are things that are not within our control. They're simply limits baked into life. And then there's physical limits, like you can't ride the big bicycle because you're simply not tall enough. And there's also bigger, profound limits, like you can't see dad because he's not here anymore. You can't see grandma because she died. So when it comes to limits, a piece of the work is supporting our kids through the upset. We want to protect our kids from any kind of disappointment and upset, but we can't. We simply can't. And so it's important to help them build the distress tolerance and other skills that they need to navigate life's limits and disappointments, and for us to support them in that disappointment. But there are also limits that are within our control that we parents set for our kids. And the truth is that I think a lot of times we sort of get into this habit. It's like a knee-jerk reaction of saying no without even pausing to think about it. So here's my recommendation. Number one is to pause and consider if a limit really is necessary. And this is where clarifying your values and your priorities is really important and helpful. For example, maybe safety limits are non negotiable, right? You can't go in the car if you don't wear a seatbelt. That is not something that I'm willing to compromise on. But maybe there are other things that your knee-jerk reaction might be to say no to that actually, if you pause and think about it, maybe get a little more information about why it is that your child wants to do the thing or is doing the thing, that might actually be okay to say yes to. And remember, you can't control their response to the limit, but you can influence it. And you can influence it by how you choose, hold, and deliver the limit. So again, the how matters. In an ideal world, if there is something that is coming up on a recurring basis, then having a problem-solving conversation about it outside of those tough moments, it can go a long way. The more we can include our kids in the conversation, give them a voice and really an authentic voice and listen to that voice, and getting curious about why it is that they want to do the thing that they want to do can really, really, really be helpful here. And then again, if there is a limit that is necessary, they may get upset about it. And that's okay. That is their right. They can get upset about it. And we can support them in that disappointment, in that upset. And that doesn't mean that whatever the limit wasn't an okay limit to set. I want to give you an example here from another client of mine. This is actually a divorced couple that I work with. I'm going to call them Mary and David. And they came to me with three pretty major concerns. One was screen time. Their neurodivergent teen was using screens a lot more than they were comfortable with. And when they were setting limits around screens, it was not going well at all. In fact, one of the other big concerns they came in with was that there were some crisis level episodes happening, crisis level meltdowns where people were getting hurt, where people weren't feeling safe and sometimes actually weren't safe, where emergency services were called, which introduces all kinds of other stressful things into the situation. So this was a pretty major deal. And then the third big problem was that the teen was often really resistant to, maybe even refusing to go to school, and had missed so much school or had been late so often that it was on the brink of being a legal concern that he had missed too much school. When they started to have some conversations with their child about what was important to him about screens, when they started to get curious and really notice what purpose the screen use was serving for him and what he wanted to do on the screens, when he wanted to use them, how he wanted to use them, they learned a lot, and they were able to, first of all, connect with the teen around this topic. They were able to see that a lot of the ways that he wanted to use it were a source of social connection for him, and that this was actually a big piece of why he didn't want to go to school, because it was extremely difficult for him on a social level. And they ultimately decreased the screen limits. They did not give him all access all the time. There have been and will continue to be ongoing conversations about how screens are used, when they're used, and so on. But they noticed that as they decreased the limits around screens, and I would say also importantly, how the limits were implemented, that actually the meltdowns, those crisis level meltdowns, disappeared. They did not have any. And not only did the school refusal stop, but now he is actually excited to go to school. He gets himself ready in the morning and he goes to school without an issue. So it really sort of unlocked this piece of the dynamic that had become so tense, so intense, and so problematic. All right, let's talk now about expectations. Expectations, I think, are hands down the hardest because they require someone else to do something. And if the other person doesn't want to do it, it feels like a demand. And I think we forget as adults, number one, how many demands and expectations are placed on our kids in a typical day. I mean, if you think about even just getting ready for school in the morning, that involves opening your eyes, getting out of bed, going to the bathroom, brushing your teeth, eating breakfast, getting your backpack, filling your water, putting your shoes on, and a whole host of other things in between. And then if they are in school, once they get to school, there's countless demands and expectations put on them. I think we adults also forget what it feels like to have that little control and to have that many expectations and demands puts on us. Imagine if you had a job or if you were in a group, a club, an organization, and the leader was constantly making you do things that you didn't want to do, was constantly giving you orders, was constantly telling you to do things. I have a feeling you would be pretty unhappy. It would feel pretty crummy, and you would probably be trying to find a way to leave that job or stop being a part of that group or organization. So, really putting yourself in your kids' shoes, recognizing that even if they're not pushing back on some of those demands, let's say in the morning, they are still going through their day with all these things that they are being expected to do that they probably don't want to do. So when you ask your kid to clear the table or empty the dishwasher, and you feel like, why is this a big deal? It seems like such a simple request. Why are they pushing back so much? Keep in mind that that request is happening in the context of them having gone through their day with a lot of demands and expectations placed on them. This doesn't mean that we can't ask them or expect them to clear their plate or empty the dishwasher. We can certainly work on that depending on your individual child's capacity. But it does mean that I think it's important to keep in mind that number one, again, you can't control someone else's behavior. You can influence it, but you can't control it. It's like that expression, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. When you use fear or use force, you may, not guaranteed, but you may get compliance. But when you use connection and compassion, that's when you can really get cooperation. And personally, I would much rather have cooperation than compliance. So then the question becomes, number one, what are reasonable expectations for your child or teen in any given moment? And that's going to vary by family. It's going to vary by you, the parent, by the child's capacity, by the context of what else is going on. And then number two, what are the most productive ways for you to express or deliver that expectation? I want to end here with another example. So this example comes from a friend of mine. We're going to call her Michelle. And Michelle homeschooled her then 5-year-old kindergartner during the first full year of COVID. But she had him doing virtual reading and writing lessons with a reading specialist. And during that year, her kiddo started having really big meltdowns, really intense, explosive, over 2 hours, people getting hurt. It was really stressful, incredibly hard. And she noticed that one of the big triggers was reading and writing, whether it be the virtual lesson or whether it was her trying to get her kid to practice. Her kid was increasingly resistant, and it came to a point where he would slam the laptop shut during the lessons, he would run out of the room, he would hide under the table, he would yell and scream, and it just wasn't working. And she got to a point where she realized, of course, I want my child to learn how to read, but right now, he's not learning. He's not going to learn if this continues. And the reality is that it is more important to me for my child to be psychologically healthy and for me to be psychologically healthy, for us to both feel and be physically and emotionally safe, than for him to learn how to read right now in this moment. And so she experimented with dropping that expectation. She stopped the lessons and she stopped asking or even prompting him to practice reading and writing. Instead, she leaned into reading to him to build up that joy of reading, to reassociate reading with something positive rather than what it had started to become, which was associated with a lot of stress and a lot of intensity. And the intense meltdowns dramatically decreased. Of course, this was just one piece of the bigger picture, but that expectation was the biggest linchpin piece. And the meltdowns dramatically decreased, their relationship dramatically improved, and ultimately, by the end of first grade, he was actually ahead of grade level when it came to reading because ultimately he did come back to being curious about and engaged in reading. Now, I'm not saying that any of the examples I gave are exactly what you should do in your family. Each family is different. And of course, if you want support around figuring out what would be helpful and work for your family, please reach out. I'm at hello@drgilaparenting.com, and I'd be happy to support you with that. But no matter what your situation, my invitation for you when you find yourself wondering if you should hold a boundary is to stop and ask yourself the first question, is this a personal boundary? Is this a limit? Or is this an expectation? And then go from there in figuring out, is this necessary? Is this on balance helpful? And how can I deliver it? How can I express it in a way that honors my child's needs and is compassionate and connection building instead of connection breaking? I hope that's helpful. And of course, please reach out if you have any questions. That's it for this episode. I am so glad you found your way here. And remember, even if you're on your own, you don't have to do it alone. You've got this.